Please be advised, this story is very graphic. Some listeners may find it distressing. The day it all went wrong. A principal's dark recollection. In my 30 years as an educator, I've seen more than my share of close calls and emergencies, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that cold November morning. The day began like any other, a brisk autumn chill in the air as students filed into the building, laughing, chatting, and completely unaware of the darkness that was about to descend upon our school. We had a solid security system in place. At least that's what I always believed. We'd implemented strict protocols, locked doors, security cameras, and a front entrance monitored by a security officer. But as I would soon learn, no system is foolproof. The attackers planned their entrance with chilling precision. They knew our routines, had likely studied them for weeks. The first misstep occurred when a delivery van arrived at the loading dock at 8:20 a.m., just as it did every Tuesday. Our security team verified the driver's credentials as usual and waved him in. What they didn't know was that the driver had been overpowered hours earlier, his uniform and truck taken by men who had no intention of making a delivery. His badly beaten and brutalized body was only found hours after the event. As the van was waved through the gates, 3 men concealed in the back prepared themselves. One of them, a tall man with a deep scar running across his chin, whispered instructions to the others. Their weapons were hidden under boxes of fake supplies, cleverly disguising the real cargo: assault rifles, handguns, and machetes. Once inside the secure perimeter, they knew exactly where to strike. The loading dock's back door led directly into a less monitored hallway that connected to the staff room, a place where security measures were more relaxed. At this time of day, teachers would be gathering for their pre-class coffee, sharing tales of what they and their families had done over the weekend, laughing and unwinding before the day truly began. At 8:35 a.m., the first shots rang out. I was in my office reviewing reports when the unmistakable sound of gunfire shattered the morning calm. My heart raced as I grabbed the intercom, broadcasting a school-wide lockdown alert. Attention all staff and students, this is not a drill. We are under attack. Secure your classrooms immediately. As the announcement echoed through the halls, I could hear the faint screams and the relentless pop of gunfire. The assailants had moved quickly, executing teachers in the staff room before they could react. The security cameras later showed how the first attacker had coldly walked into the room, opened fire, and then methodically finished off anyone still breathing with a machete.
Get down, all of you now.
He barked at the remaining teachers, who huddled under tables, some praying, others too shocked to move.
Please, no,
one teacher begged, only to be silenced by a brutal swing of the machete. The blood spattered across the room, painting a gruesome picture of terror and violence. While the massacre in the staff room continued, the other attackers spread out into the school, splitting up to cause maximum carnage. They moved with terrifying efficiency, taking down anyone in their path. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the sickening thud of the machete as it found its mark echoed in the corridors. As principal, I knew every inch of this school, but the knowledge did nothing to stop the horror unfolding. I could hear them advancing, the screams growing louder as they got closer to the classrooms. My heart sank when I realised that our security officer had been the first to die, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the attack, his weapon still holstered as he was gunned down at the front desk.
Clear this hallway,
one of the attackers yelled.
Anyone who resists dies slower.
They moved with purpose, entering classrooms, dragging out students and teachers alike. Some teachers tried to barricade their doors, but these men were prepared. They had bolt cutters to break through locks and chains, and even a handheld battering ram to smash through doors. Mrs. Dawson, a veteran teacher with over 25 years of experience, was in her classroom when the attackers burst in. She huddled the petrified students behind her and confronted the attackers as they breached the locked door and a futile barricade she and her students had hastily built.
Stay back,
she shouted, brandishing a metal ruler as if it were a weapon.
You won't touch these kids. I won't let you harm them,
she said, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. The attacker smiled cruelly. His response was swift and merciless. He raised his machete and slashed her across the chest. Mrs. Dawson fell to the floor, gasping for air, her hands stained with her own blood. But she didn't cry out. She remained silent, even as the life ebbed from her. The attacker stepped over her body and flailed at the children with the machete. The children screamed in terror, frozen by the merciless horror they had just witnessed, their cries cutting through the chaos. Mrs. Dawson, with the last of her strength, reached out and grabbed the man's leg, trying to stop him. He looked down at her with disdain before plunging his machete into her back. Meanwhile, Mr. Fields, our janitor, had been making his rounds when the shooting started. He immediately ran towards the source of the commotion, only to come face to face with one of the attackers in the East Wing, where a group of kindergarten students were gathered.
"Run, kids, get out of here!"
Mr. Fields shouted, standing between the children and the gunman. The attacker, seeing an easy target, raised his rifle. But Mr. Fields didn't back down. He charged at the man, using his broom as an improvised weapon. The attacker, caught off guard by the janitor's bravery, fired a shot that missed its mark.
"Not today, you bastard!"
Mr. Fields growled, swinging the broom with all his might. The attacker sneered, effortlessly dodging the blow before swinging his machete. The blade smashed through the broom handle and sliced into Mr. Fields' chest, the force knocking him to the ground. Blood poured from the wound as he struggled to get back up, his eyes filled with defiance even as his strength waned.
"Get away from them!"
He gasped, but the attacker only laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed in the hallway. With one swift motion, the man brought the machete down again, silencing the janitor for good. The children, too shocked to scream, watched in horror as the life left Mr. Fields' eyes. The attacker wiped the blood from his blade, a satisfied grin on his face as he turned to the terrified children.
You're next.
He hissed, raising the machete. But before he could strike, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived, and the attacker, knowing his time was short, let the machete hang by his side and grabbed the automatic weapon hanging from his shoulder. A 2-second burst ended 14 young lives in the blink of an eye, an act of despicable insanity that would have irredeemable consequences for the lives left behind. By the time the police stormed the building, the damage had been done. Bodies lay strewn across the halls, classrooms were smeared with blood, and the once peaceful school was now a scene of unimaginable horror. It had more in common with an abattoir than a place of learning. I watched numb as the officers moved methodically through the building, securing the site and tending to the wounded. My school, my sanctuary, had become a battlefield, and I couldn't shake the guilt that weighed heavy on my heart. Could I have done more? Should I have seen the signs, anticipated the possibility of such an attack? These questions haunted me as I stood in the middle of the carnage, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. The survivors, those who had hidden or managed to escape, were led out of the building in tears and hysterics, their faces pale and numb with shock. I saw Mrs. Dawson's students, the few that had survived the vicious attack, their clothes stained with her blood, their eyes vacant as they were escorted to safety. The youngest children, barely able to comprehend what had happened, clung to the officers, their small bodies trembling, clothes soiled from the traumatizing fear they had experienced only minutes ago. I'll never forget the sight of Mr. Fields' body, slumped against the wall, his eyes still open, staring blankly ahead. He had been a good man, always kind and patient with the kids, and now he was gone, another victim of a senseless act of violence. The media descended on Pine Creek like vultures, eager to feast on the tragedy. They wanted to know how it could have happened, how the attackers had managed to breach our defences so easily. But there were no easy answers. They, as usual without investigation, wanted to apportion blame on the innocent, to sensationalise the most heinous crime imaginable, with no thought for the survivors or those that had lost their lives trying to protect their children. The investigation revealed that the attackers had ties to a domestic extremist group, their motives fueled by hatred and a desire to make a statement. They had planned the attack meticulously, exploiting every weakness in our security system, every blind spot, to carry out their deadly mission. In the weeks that followed, I did everything I could to support my staff, my students, and their families. We held memorials for the victims, provided counselling for the survivors, and worked tirelessly to rebuild the school's shattered sense of safety, both visible and invisible. The hallways where the attacks took place were repainted, the bloodstains scrubbed away, but the memories lingered. The classrooms felt empty without the teachers we had lost, and the laughter of the children was tinged with sadness, a reminder of the innocence that had been stolen from them. As for me, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. I knew deep down that no amount of security measures could have fully prevented such a determined attack. But that didn't stop the gnawing guilt, the relentless replaying of events in my mind, searching for something, anything, I could have done differently. In the days following the massacre, I barely slept. My dreams were haunted by the faces of those we lost, by the screams that echoed in the hallways. Every corner of the school held memories of that dark day, and each one tore at my soul. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had failed them all, my staff, my students, my community. The investigation was swift, as such things go. The police and federal agencies descended on Pine Creek, combing through every detail of the attack. They interviewed the survivors, sifted through security footage, and pored over the attackers' backgrounds. The men were identified as part of a radicalized group that had slipped under the radar, their hatred festering in the dark corners of the internet. They had chosen our school because of its perceived vulnerability, its location in a small, tight-knit community, and the symbolic nature of attacking a place of learning. I sat through endless debriefings, reliving the horror again and again as I answered questions about our protocols, our security measures, and the decisions made that morning. The media frenzy didn't help. They painted our school as a symbol of failure, a cautionary tale of what happens when evil goes unchecked. The reporters shoved microphones in my face, demanding answers that I didn't have, while pundits on TV dissected every aspect of our security, pointing fingers and assigning blame. Armchair warriors, all with opinions and de facto solutions after the event, most not connected in any way with the reality or carnage of the situation, sat at home thousands of miles away. In quieter moments, I thought about Mrs. Dawson and Mr. Fields, about the teachers and students who had died trying to protect each other. Their bravery in the face of unimaginable terror was a beacon of hope in an otherwise dark time. But it also deepened my sorrow. They had been the true heroes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let them down. "Principal Myers," one of the parents said to me during a meeting, her voice shaky. "How do we know this won't happen again? How do we send our kids here and trust that they'll be safe?" I didn't have a perfect answer, but I told her the truth. "We can never eliminate every risk," I said, looking her in the eye. "But we've taken every step we can to make sure this school is as safe as possible. We've learned from what happened and we won't let it happen again. We owe that to our children and to those we lost." As the months passed, life at Pine Creek Elementary began to find a new rhythm. The laughter of children returned, hesitant at first but gradually more confident. The staff, though still grieving, threw themselves into their work with renewed purpose. We were determined to create an environment where our students could learn and grow without fear, where they could reclaim their innocence. But the scars remained. Some were visible: the repaired walls, the new security cameras, the metal detectors at the entrances. Others were less so: the haunted look in the eyes of the survivors, the nightmares that plagued us all, the ever-present sense of vigilance. I kept a picture of Mrs. Dawson and Mr. Fields on my desk, a daily reminder of their bravery. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by the weight of my responsibilities, I looked at their faces and found strength in their memory. They had given everything to protect their students, and I would do the same. One afternoon, as I was walking through the halls, I passed a group of third graders working on a class project. They were making posters about what they wanted to be when they grew up. I stopped to chat with them, my heart lifting as they excitedly told me about their dreams of becoming doctors, artists, and astronauts. "Principal Myers," one little girl said, looking up at me with wide eyes, "do you think I can be a teacher when I grow up?" I smiled, feeling a lump in my throat. "Of course you can," I replied, kneeling down to her level, "and you'll be an amazing one." The last lesson. The day had begun like any other. Birchwood High buzzed with the usual morning energy, students milling around, chatting about homework, weekend plans, and the latest gossip. Mr. Davies, the chemistry teacher, prepared his lab for the day's experiments. A man of order and precision, he prided himself on running a disciplined but fun class with his students. They knew him as a calm, collected figure, someone who always seemed to have everything under control. Poppy sat at her usual station near the front, carefully arranging her notes and waiting for the bell to ring. Mr. Davies was already at the board, drawing out diagrams for the experiment they were set to begin. There was something reassuring about his methodical nature, a sense that everything was in its place and always within his control. The bell rang, and just as Mr. Davies opened his mouth to begin the lesson, the school's PA system crackled to life. The principal's voice came through, urgent and strained.
Attention, students and staff. We are now in a lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill.
Mr. Davies froze for a split second, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. Then, without missing a beat, he turned to the class, his voice steady but firm.
Everyone, move to the back of the lab now. Stay low, stay quiet.
Turning his attention to the class captain.
McGuire, call 911 and confirm the attack. Everyone else, stay off your phones.
McGuire immediately did as requested, reported the attack and stayed on the call with the dispatcher operator, who confirmed that it had already been called in, and the police, SWAT and emergency units were on their way. Poppy's heart pounded as she quickly got up and moved with the others, adrenaline surging through her veins. Mr. Davies locked the door and turned off the lights. The classroom plunged into semi-darkness, the only light coming from the small windows high on the walls. Mr. Davies moved swiftly, pulling a large metal cabinet across the door. It wasn't much, but it was heavy and would buy them some time. He knew, however, that if someone was determined enough, it wouldn't hold for long. He motioned for the students to crouch down behind the lab tables at the back of the room.
Stay calm.
He whispered, his voice low.
We're going to be okay.
But Poppy saw the tension in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he listened to the faint sounds coming from the hallway. Distant shouts, the echo of heavy footsteps, and the ominous thud of doors being kicked in and shots fired. The muffled pop of gunfire reverberated through the walls, followed by a scream. The sound cut through the room like a knife, freezing everyone in place. Poppy bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might stop altogether. Mr. Davies moved to the centre of the room, his eyes darting around as if calculating something. He was thinking, Poppy realised, his mind working furiously behind his calm exterior. He glanced at the storage cabinet, then back at the students, and seemed to come to a decision.
Listen to me.
He said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a grim determination.
We don't have much time. I need you all to stay as quiet as possible and do exactly as I say.
He moved to the storage cabinet and began pulling out various chemicals, his movements quick and efficient. Poppy watched in stunned silence as he laid out bottles of sulfuric acid, glycerin and potassium chlorate. His hands were steady as he worked, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside the lab.
Mr. Davies, what are you doing?
Poppy couldn't help but ask, her voice trembling. He glanced up at her, his eyes sharp.
We're going to have a backup plan. If that door comes down, I need to be ready to protect you.
The weight of his words sank in, and Poppy realised what he was doing. He was building something dangerous. Mr. Davies quickly mixed the chemicals with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, even if under vastly different circumstances. The other students watched, their fear momentarily replaced by morbid curiosity.
I need you all to stay back,
he said once more, his voice firm as he assembled the makeshift device, layering the compounds together with the practiced hands of a seasoned chemist. Poppy's breath caught in her throat as she realised what he was making, a bomb. An incendiary device, designed to burn at extreme temperatures. The science behind it was sound. Poppy knew that much. They had studied these reactions in class, albeit on a much smaller, safer scale. But seeing it now, with the full understanding of what it was meant for, sent a cold shiver down her spine.
Melissa, grab the respirators and safety goggles and hand them out. Quickly, there's a good girl.
She pushed through her rising fear and did what was asked without comment. Once he'd finished the task at hand, Mr. Davies quickly grabbed 2 fire extinguishers that were strategically mounted around the laboratory and put them on the floor at the back of the lab. He then grabbed the fire blankets by the fume cupboard, opened them up and used them to cover the students that were nestled together behind the bench furthest from the door. Suddenly, Poppy stood and raced to a nearby cupboard and grabbed a battery strobe light they had used in a previous experiment. She put it on Mr. Davies' desk at the other side of the room, nearest to the door.
Poppy! Get back under the blankets, now!
She spun and raced back behind the bench. On her way, she placed the remote control for the strobe light in Mr. Davies's hand. Smiling, he nodded his understanding.
Thanks, Poppy. You all just earned yourselves an A+.
The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of the lab's door handle being rattled. A deep, angry voice cursed from the other side.
Fuck! Open the door!
The students stiffened, their eyes wide with terror as they peered through the gaps in the fire blankets. Mr. Davies stood in the darkened room by the lab table, his hand resting on the homemade bomb. The door shuddered as the man outside kicked it violently, each blow echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The cabinet behind the door creaked under the strain, but it wouldn't hold for much longer. The door splintered on the next kick, and a few more blows sent the cabinet crashing to the floor. The man stepped through the wreckage, a hulking figure with a shotgun in his hands, his face twisted in a grimace of rage. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Mr. Davies, who stood his ground, the bomb now hidden behind his back. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The man sneered, raising his shotgun and levelling it at Mr. Davies.
Say hello to my little friend.
He barked as his finger tightened on the trigger. Mr. Davies moved with a speed and precision that took the intruder by surprise. He powered the strobe light which in the darkened room fired out a rapid sequence of blinding light, instantly disorienting the attacker who spun to his right and fired the shotgun. The strobe light and part of Mr. Davies' desk disintegrated as the shot impacted. Mr. Davies then hurled the bomb at the man's feet and dived behind the lab table. The device hit the floor and shattered, the chemicals inside reacting almost instantaneously. A bright flash of light filled the room, followed by a wave of intense heat. The incendiary bomb ignited and the man screamed, a high, shrill sound that cut through the air as flames erupted around him. The fire spread rapidly, engulfing his legs, then climbing up his body as he thrashed wildly, trying in vain to extinguish the blaze. The shotgun clattered to the floor as he stumbled back into the corridor, totally engulfed in flames, still screaming. The smell of burning flesh and chemicals filled the room, acrid and choking. Poppy buried her face in her arms, trying to block out the horrific sounds. Mr. Davies held them close, shielding them from the worst of the blast. The man's screams grew weaker, then stopped altogether. The fire burned on, consuming everything in its path. The room was filled with thick black smoke, and the fire alarm blared, sending a piercing wail through the building. The sprinkler fire suppression system activated and prevented the fire from spreading. Mr. Davies coughed, struggling to catch his breath, grabbing a fire extinguisher as he guided the students toward the broken door and into the corridor.
Come on, we need to get out.
He urged, his voice hoarse. He pulled the pin from the extinguisher and pointed it at the burning body. But before he could activate it, Poppy snatched it from his grasp and discarded it on the floor.
Let the bastard burn.
She growled. Mr. Davies nodded with a grin and ushered them all out the nearest exit. Poppy gasped as the fresh air hit her lungs, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Davies was the last to emerge, his hands shaking from the adrenaline and the aftershocks of what he had done. The distant sound of sirens that grew louder with every passing second. Police and SWAT stormed the campus, officers shouting commands, students fleeing in every direction. Poppy collapsed on the grass, her legs too weak to hold her up any longer. Mr. Davies knelt beside her, his face drawn and exhausted. As paramedics checked them over, the students looked back at the smouldering lab. The image of the intruder's burning figure was seared into their minds, a nightmare that would haunt them for years. But they were alive thanks to Mr. Davies using his knowledge as a weapon to protect them.
Bloody Mary's Horror Stories. Watch, like, and subscribe.